Mr. Jacyk achieved something very important. Not only did he establish, that portion which he funded, but he also sent a signal to other parts of the Ukrainian community that Ukrainian studies was real and that it was here to stay at Columbia, at Harriman. And it was thanks to that subsequent donors continued to contribute both to the Slavics department, but especially to the Harriman Institute. And that's very important. He was, as it were, the first signal, right? And since he was serious and had clout, the fact that he thought Ukrainian studies was worth supporting at Columbia meant that other people could be assured that they wouldn't be wasting their money by contributing to Ukrainian studies. So that, I think, is extremely important. As to the success of the program, I think, frankly, it's, again, I don't want to be self-serving, but it's been successful. It's doing precisely what it set out to do. It's providing knowledge of the Ukrainian language, culture, history, and politics, right? Sometimes economics, primarily to students from various schools, from various departments, who need to know something about Ukraine, but don't necessarily need to be PhDs in Ukrainian studies. In that way, we are actually contributing and enhancing their employability. Because by acquiring that additional knowledge, they are more attractive potential employers in the real world or in the academic world. And then, of course, other institutions can produce the PhD. So I think that's been very successful. And it's reflected in the fact that if you look at the students who take courses at the Harriman, whether it's with Professor Shevchuk, who teaches Ukrainian language and cinema, whether it's with Professor Kuchinsky, the former ambassador of Ukraine to the United Nations, who teaches courses on Ukrainian politics, whether it's with Professor Andreychik, who teaches courses on Ukrainian literature, or whether it's courses with me. I come in as a visiting professor and I teach a course on the Ukrainian community in New York City. What is striking is that in all these courses, the vast majority of the students are not of Ukrainian background. Now, of course, it would be nice if we also had more Ukrainians. But the important point is that the message that Ukraine exists, that it's an interesting, important country, politically, economically, culturally, linguistically, and so on, that message is reaching non-Ukrainian audiences. And that's precisely the audiences that need to be reached. And I think Harriman is doing that quite successfully. Columbia has always had a strong presence in Ukrainian studies, going back to at least the 1930s, when Ukrainian students at Columbia University raised money for Ukrainian language instruction. Then in the 1950s, as the so-called Soviet interview project, Soviet refugee interview project was being conducted, many of the people who were interviewed for that project were Ukrainians, and many of the interviewers were people who were associated with Columbia or it was then known as the Russian Institute. In addition to that, keep in mind that Columbia consisted not only of the Harriman Institute, and remember again, it was known as the Russian Institute, it also had the Institute on East Central Europe. And the Institute on East Central Europe had a very distinct Ukrainian component. I even took a course when I was an undergraduate at Columbia in the 1970s with Professor Andrzej Kamiński, a Polish scholar, and the course was on Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. So there was a lot in the background. The most important was that Harriman, or the Russian Institute, or more generally Columbia, always had a very strong presence in the study of the non-Russian nationalities. So there were people in Armenian studies, there were people who did Central Asia, there were people who did Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, and other places like that. Many of these languages were also being offered on a regular basis. And a lot of this has to do with the initiative of a professor of Central Asian Studies by the name of Edward Allworth. It was in the 1970s that he established at Columbia something called the Program on Soviet Nationality Studies. And again, I know this because I know this, but I also took courses with Professor Allworth and attended many of those meetings. And that too had a focus, which again, it focused on all the nationalities or on many of the nationalities, but it also had a distinct Ukrainian focus. Finally, very important for Harriman's, and by now we're talking about the Harriman Institute because it's no longer the Russian Institute by the 1980s, but very important for the Harriman's commitment to Ukrainian studies was the establishment in 1988 of a program. It was known as the Nationality and Siberian Studies Program. It existed for 4 years, and it had $650,000 at its disposal from the Mellon Foundation. And I was placed in charge of that program. So for 4 years, we organized conferences, workshops. We published some 5 to 10 books and magazines and journals and things of that sort. We also funded courses. So we hired Professor Miroslava Znayenko to teach Ukrainian. We also gave money for other nationality studies. But for those 4 years, and remember, this is the time when the Soviet Union is falling apart. For those 4 years, the Harriman Institute had a key role to play in the study of the non-Russian nationalities in general and Ukraine in particular. So that by the 1990s, this program ends in 1992. By the time the Harriman, and this was the director, Richard Erickson, and myself, I was then the associate director of the Institute. When we turned to Mr. Jacyk and other potential funders for support, we were doing so on the basis of a very firm foundation. A foundation that had extended for 50 years, included a variety of scholars, programs, initiatives, courses, publications, and the rest. So we weren't just asking for seed money. We were asking for money that would enable us to institutionalize what was already present. It was in summer of 1992 that Erickson and I became the directors and associate director of the Harriman. And I believe it was in the fall of 1992, it may have been a little later, I'm not sure exactly, that we wrote a series of letters to some 10 potential funders for Ukrainian studies. And again, this is a reflection of Erickson's commitment to Ukrainian studies, although he himself was a specialist on the Russian economy. And we wrote primarily I believe we wrote to the Ukrainian National Association, to the various self-reliance banks, and of course, we addressed a letter to the Petro Jacyk Foundation in Toronto. The letters went out, and I believe we received very few, if any, responses, until one day we got a letter from Mr. Jacyk. Not only did we get a letter, but it contained a check. I don't recall the exact amount, but I believe it was something in the order of $50,000, $70,000, $80,000. In other words, serious money. And we were surprised and shocked, and of course delighted that he was interested. And I believe the letter said that he might consider giving us more if we were to express an interest, and so on and so forth. And again, the exact details are fuzzy, although I'm sure the correspondence is still somewhere in the Harriman Institute archives. And it was roughly within a year, maybe half a year later, I forget exactly when, that I traveled to Toronto in order to meet with Mr. Jacyk. And I remember taking, I believe it was the subway to Mississauga. Is that right? And I went into the office and I had a conversation with Mr. Jacyk, lasted about 30, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, but it was a very nice conversation. We kind of hit it off. I'm not of his generation, but my parents, of course, were, so that there were a variety of commonalities. And I believe we spoke in Ukrainian. Yes, we spoke in Ukrainian, as a matter of fact. And in any case, he was interested in knowing, well, how serious were we? He had given us the 50,000 or 75,000, which was nice, but as I said, it wasn't a fundamental commitment on his part. And he wanted to know how serious we were and what we intended to do with the money. And I was telling him, well, pretty much what I told you, that we had a background for 4 years of various intensive research on the nationalities, that we were committed to Ukrainian studies if only for the simple reason that Ukraine was the key non-Russian nationality. And in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, all attention by policymakers, diplomats, business people, scholars would obviously be directed at Ukraine first and foremost. And that we would, of course, be introducing courses on a variety of topics. We didn't have a permanent member of the faculty devoted to Ukrainian studies, but we had faculty members who were offering either courses devoted to Ukraine or components of courses devoted to Ukraine. Anyway, I had that conversation. We parted on very genial terms. I believe I flew back the next day. And then within a few, again, I don't recall exactly, I think it was within a few weeks, possibly within a few months, Mr. Jacyk informed us, or the foundation informed us. It may have been his daughter. I don't remember. But the foundation informed us that they would be willing to give us a substantial amount of money. I believe it was $500,000, but there again, I'm not exactly certain. And there you go. Once we learned of that, we realized that we needed to commemorate this event. And we organized a special evening dedicated to Mr. Jacyk. He flew down from Toronto, and we had a very elegant dinner with speeches. The president of the university was in attendance, and other honorati associated with Ukrainian community, and of course with Ukrainian studies. This was held in the main administrative building at Columbia known as Low Library. And it was a lovely event. And of course, Mr. Jacyk was there. And I believe it was at the event that he presented us with the check. And then the rest was pretty much history, so to speak. In the 1990s, I was at Columbia at the Harriman until 1999, January of 1999. And the Ukrainian Studies program was formally established 1 or 2 years later. But in the course of the 1990s, while I was still there, we continued with the courses, offering Ukrainian language, offering courses in Ukrainian literature. They were taught by Yuri Tarnavsky, the poet. Eventually, Vitaly Chernetsky was brought on board into the Slavics department. Mark von Hagen, who was initially a historian of Russia, eventually rebranded himself as a historian of Ukraine. And when he became director of the Institute, this was in 1997, I believe. But in any case, thereabouts, roughly in the mid-1990s. Then, of course, Ukrainian studies became even more of a focus of the Institute because it was no longer associated just with me. It was now associated with me, the associate director, and the director, Mark von Hagen. And as you know, Mark von Hagen was very committed to Ukrainian studies. He was very dedicated to Ukrainian studies. He eventually became the president of the International Ukrainian Studies Association. He had contacts all over the world, and it was due to him during my tenure at Columbia, mostly after I left Columbia, that he was able to place Ukrainian studies on a firm foundation within the intellectual community, not just of the United States and Canada, but of Europe and, of course, Ukraine.